Hey everyone, Pupsker here, and today we're going to have a review for the Callisto Protocol. We're going to talk about should you buy the game, should you try it out, maybe why you shouldn't buy it, etc, etc. It was a game with a highly anticipated launch. It was in many ways a spiritual successor to Dead Space, and on launch, while it was, if you kind of ignore performance issues, a pretty okay game, it by no means is anything special, so let's get into that now. Oh god, on launch, this game was a mess. It was riddled with performance issues, especially worse on PC, which looks like the worst platform to have purchased it on day one. The game was filled with stuttering, frame rate issues during cutscenes, gameplay, loading in, pop-in. I straight up at one point froze a handful of times really for maybe like 2 to 3 seconds, and then just like the cutscene popped up or something in front of me started happening or popping up. So the game is definitely pretty buggy, with patches coming out and releasing that have definitely helped this, but it's by no means made it perfect. So I'm running a pretty beefy PC, okay? And I by no means should be having any issues like this with like a 3080 and my CPU, right? Shouldn't be happening, but lo and behold, it is. So performance issues are high, and there's really no getting around that other than just like tweaking it a little bit, but yeah, it is what it is. From there, the gameplay itself is fun when you start playing the game, but simple. The controls and ideas are simple. You go left, right, and avoid the enemies punching left or right, and you just dodge that. Left click is melee, and you can do a charged melee as well. You can also use guns. You eventually unlock a ton after the first like 2-3 hours of the game, and you have a kind of like psychic hold where you just pick enemies up, pick items up, and throw them. Really, it's Dead Space, right? Like, no doubt about that. It's Dead Space without being quite as good as Dead Space, so kind of funny there. You recharge your mana, which is essentially your like power throw pickup, gravitational pull, whatever you want to call it, and get ammo for guns. But your melee is infinite, and you can kind of, if you play well, be good and dodge everything if you're in a perfect scenario. But that's kind of not how the game plays out. While this sounds pretty interesting at the start, it gets pretty boring past the first like handful of hours, past the halfway mark. The general way they want you to do combat seems to be like avoid all attacks using just your left and your right key, AD, that's literally all, and then just melee it. When the pop-up for guns happens, you whip out your gun and shoot them, rinse, repeat. You can dismember enemies, and while it's not super OP, you can shoot out their legs and they fall, shoot out their arm, they can't like quite attack you with that as easily, so it's not the worst, but it's not as like cool as Dead Space. When the tentacles pop out, you gotta shoot those to make sure they don't transform into like mutant overpowered mode. So it's, you know, unique in some sense and does a little bit of cool stuff like that, but it's just reminiscent of Dead Space, so nothing like too unique. It's just things like from Dead Space, but in this game, right? That's why a lot of times you'll be seeing people just be like, oh, this is like Dead Space, but not Dead Space. So that's why it's like the spiritual successor of Dead Space. People who worked on Dead Space or like directors, something like that. Big people who worked on that worked on this. So yeah, that's what people kind of thought of Dead Space and the Callisto Protocol. It was a fun game though, so I'll give it that. The combat could be a little better. Once I started fighting more enemies, it ended up happening where there was just like 3-4 enemies, small corridor. I couldn't really melee them because it would just get me attacked by the other enemies, and then I'd get into a weird sort of flick of dodge animating other enemies, and the camera would throw all around. So I was essentially like blind trying to fight enemies because the camera would throw itself around everywhere because you're dodging, and then I'd just kind of be left clicking, hitting A and D randomly trying to dodge as enemies would just Hail Mary me. So it could get a little chaotic, hectic, and just downright a shit show. Not in a good way either, because you don't have the best tools to deal with it. you can pick enemies up and throw them, but then other enemies still attack you and things like that. So it can get kind of weird and kind of annoying. Combat is simple in that way too. So after the first half of the game, it just gets so repetitive, right? Because the first little bit of the game, you really only have a melee and then maybe like one dinky gun. And then you just start unlocking guns and rapid fire for a little bit, like 1 an hour. So the pacing is also really weird there. But the game made sense when it was more melee with like one gun, and then it just got so hectic where you end up dodging people who are just like crowding you, and they're, oh god. It was still fun, but it just seemed to get a little hectic and just kind of goofy. The camera was just so jarring. Ugh. But anyways, that's kind of how combat goes. It's not bad, but it's not good. It's just too simple and kind of whatever. But if you like it, you like it. I had fun for the most part, more so in the beginning, but it did drag on. The story is a little bit of the same. Stories, character, world building, we'll throw it all together, right? It starts off pretty good, interesting, right? You're like, okay, this is what's happening. Nice, I like it. It's going down, you learn things little by little. Cool. But then it just kind of keeps going on. You get an idea of what the story is after a while, and you're like, okay, I get it. But then they keep revealing the story, and you're like, yeah, okay. So it's a very obvious cliche played out story. It's literally Dead Space or any sort of Plague story. So nothing unique or different there. It's cool, but you know, nothing special. It was kind of confusing in the beginning, but you know, that's how they always go, where the last like 3 hours, you already know the ending to the story pretty much, and it just kind of drags out. It's crazy. This game is really good at being pretty cool for a while, and then just dragging itself out. So it could definitely fix that problem within itself, right? It could definitely fix it. But it was a fun game. Right now, the game doesn't have any sort of DLC. It's going to come out in a little bit. That should be adding a new game plus mode, but on release, this game straight up did not have a new game plus mode. And once you beat it, it's over. This game took me 7 hours and 15 minutes because I went and checked my load file after. But I feel like it took me more like 8-9 hours with like me running around doing other stuff because I was streaming the entire time, right? So it's not terrible. The 5 guns in the game, by the way, just end up being more of the same. You get pistols and then explosive guns. And overall, it's pretty cool, right? I don't mind it. Like shotguns, pistols, wow. Some things explode, some things don't. The unlock tree and the purchasing system is Dead Space. It's pretty good. It's pretty linear with some side trees, but nothing overall too big. Eventually, throughout the game, you just straight up get a health armor suit, and it just looks like the Dead Space armor as well. So the amount of like tie-ins this game has for Dead Space is kind of crazy. You could really tell they were going for Dead Space, but not Dead Space, right? Like, I can't say it enough. It's the main theme of this game is Dead Space if it wasn't Dead Space. And it was a good game, but like, you could just play Dead Space if you want a good game like this. The game itself was beautiful, but it ran like shit, so that kind of took away from that. So, hey, it is what it is. I'm not too happy with it, but I'm not overly mad at it as a game. I had fun playing it, so I might actually come back with the New Game Plus to check it out, see if I can just like beat the hell out of some enemies, but it wasn't a terrible experience. The boss enemies in this game, oh my god, they suck. There's really like only 1, maybe 2 bosses depending. There's the final boss, which is just an enemy. Okay, he's nothing really special. And then there is the other big boss, which is recycled like 3 to 4 times maybe. The first time you think you see a boss in the game, it's actually just a new enemy type that like spits acid or something. And then the second time you see an enemy, or sorry, boss, it's just the same boss over and over again. So the second time you see it, you're like, oh, cool. But then this is like the game's default, oh, boss enemy. Anytime they need a boss, they throw this enemy at you. And it's a stupid boss because you can't melee it, you can only dodge it and shoot it. Which kind of, I thought, took away from the entire point of this game's main mechanic of being able to melee everything. So, I don't know. It was kind of a bad boss. You can just infinitely dodge it and eventually just kill it with guns. That's also something I want to talk about to end off the review, though, is the dodging mechanic in the game seems pretty buggy at times as well. I would dodge enemies, dodge big attacks, etc. when only there was one enemy, and I would still get hit sometimes. I don't know why. I would do the full animation, get out of the way, and they would still end up hitting me. And this would happen on like the big bosses too. It would get out of the way and then the attack would go off and I would die. And I actually was so confused by this a handful of times. So the game's combat, even if they're trying to make it more fluid and perfect, it's still buggy and you can still get one shot and hit when you dodge. So overall, let's be real here. I think this game is kind of okay once it fixes the patching and bugginess of all the frame rate issues, stuttering, lagging, freezing, popping in and out, like pop-ups, right? Once that gets fixed, this game is probably a solid like 5 or 6 out of 10. But with all of the lagging, stuttering, and all of that issue, the performance problems, I think it's probably like 3 to 4 out of 10. I had fun hanging out with chat and just playing it casually because, you know, I'm more so down to try new games, but after the first half of the game, I was kind of over it and I was just trying to rush it. After like 4 or 5 hours, I was like, okay, let's get this over with. No new enemy types were popping up. There's only like 2, 3, 4 enemy types in the entire game, other than maybe a boss and the boss enemy type. So yeah, maybe there's 5. There's, I think, 3, maybe 4 regular enemies, right? There's the regular enemies, they pop up and grow into something a little stronger. There's the spitter guys. There's some random trap enemies. Yeah, it's kind of underwhelming. So it's an okay game, but maybe wait for it to go on sale. It's probably not worth the full AAA price for most people who want to like spend value purchase games, right? This is not a value purchase of a game. This is something you should buy if you have some money to throw away, if you like the idea of the game, and if you're probably willing to wait and try it out later on for updates as well. The systems were entirely Dead Space, stomping the enemies for items pretty much. So if you like Dead Space, you'd probably like this, but you might get disappointed because it's not as good as Dead Space, so you might just be better off playing Dead Space 1 or 2. So that's what I think of this game. I'm kind of curious what everyone else thinks. As always, if you liked or if this helped at all, like, sub, comment down below. It all helps the YouTube algorithm gods. So thank you all. I do appreciate it. And I will see you next time. Peace.